this week marks the start of a process to find Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng's successor. The Presidency is expected to publish a list of candidates today after public nominations closed on Friday. The Judicial Service Commission will also from this week rerun interviews for vacancies in superior courts following a court challenge by the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Let's get you the latest on some of these discussions. We're speaking to CASAC's Executive Secretary Lawson Naidoo, who joins us via our video link in Cape Town. Also part of the discussion is the spokesperson for the JSC, Advocate Dali Mpofu. To both of our guests, thanks very much indeed for joining us so early on a Monday morning. Advocate Mpofu, can I begin with you this morning and the fact that the Judicial Service Commission is rerunning these interviews without contesting that court decision? Is it an admission that there are flaws in terms of the process to appoint judges?
No, not at all. What we made clear was that our primary aim was really to alleviate the situation that is in the Constitutional Court. As you might know, there are 4 vacancies, and soon there'll be 5. And therefore, if we were going to be mired in long litigation, it was going to lead to a situation where that court was going to be, put in a very precarious position. And therefore, if you like, you could call it pragmatism and the broader interests of South Africa and the Constitutional Court was the weightiest factor that made us to rather do it like this so that the interviews are redone and the court can be properly serviced.
I wonder whether there's any merit in redoing the interviews, Advocate Mpofu, given that there are clear gaps in the process to appoint judges, not least of which, a set of clear criteria that each of the panelists and, in fact, the candidates have as well when they're answering questions, a clear set of criteria on paper insofar as that Q&A session is concerned?
No, the criteria are very clear. They've been clear for the past almost 3 decades. And the criteria, remember, come directly from the Constitution. And there have been, remarks about how those criteria can be improved. But nobody can ever claim that they don't know what the criteria are. Those criteria are spelled out clearly in the Act, in the JSA Act. And we have guidelines. And so the reason why these interviews are done in public is exactly so that the public can participate and also criticize us, sometimes constructively, sometimes negatively. But that's part of the process. There's nothing really strange about that. And also, of course, for a particular candidate, the criteria are even further limited by their own very extensive pack that we deal with, where we look at the person's particular judgments, their own track record. And the questions are fairly standard, although varied, obviously, because you cannot have all the commissioners asking the same thing. They are really out there to look for the person's experience and suitability, broadly speaking.
Lawson Naidoo is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. And Lawson, this unprecedented step that the JSC is taking in terms of rerunning this process is because of CASAC.
Good morning, Michelle. Indeed it is. And the reason it's being rerun is because the interviews that the JSC conducted in April were fundamentally flawed. And as much as Mr. Mpofu would like to spin it, there is a recognition that these interviews needed to be redone, or else the JSC would not have settled this matter and agreed to rerun these interviews if they felt that everything was above board. A couple of other points. If the JSC is so concerned about filling vacancies in the Constitutional Court, why did they wait so long to fill those 2 vacancies, particularly the vacancy of Justice Froneman, which had been in existence for such a long time and only came about to be interviewed in April this year? So the JSC has not been doing its best in terms of expeditiously filling vacancies on the court. Secondly, Mr. Mpofu talks about clear criteria. But the Constitution merely says that candidates have to be appropriately qualified and fit and proper people. That is not unpacked in any clear way, which is why there's been a debate about the criteria that the JSC needs to use, and we've been arguing for years that clear criteria need to be properly defined and published so that everybody is clear about it. There is no such criteria that is agreed across the board. There have been various attempts at defining this criteria, including an attempt by CASAC, Freedom Under Law and Judges Matter, a couple of weeks ago. The criteria that we have circulated to the JSC, which includes issues of integrity and conscientiousness of the candidates, their independence, their skills and technical competence, as well as their commitment to constitutional values. And those are should be the guiding criteria, and not where we went to in the April interviews, where candidates were being harangued about their political views, about cases that they had presided over, in which the commissioners themselves were litigants, which is wholly, wholly unacceptable. And it is for those reasons that these interviews are being rerun, as well as the fact that when the JSC met in its closed session to consider those candidates from the April interviews, there was no meaningful discussion about the attributes of each of those candidates vis-a-vis each other. The Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng merely produced a list of 5 names out of nowhere, which the JSC then proceeded to vote upon without any meaningful deliberation. And that's why CASAC described the JSC process as a sham, and which is why the JSC ultimately agreed to a settlement, because they would have lost in court.
Advocate Mpofu, your response, not least of which, why rerun the process if there was no issue around the process to start with?
Thank you, Michelle. Look, I don't think there's any point in me repeating myself on that score. I'm not here to be involved in a tit-for-tat, discussion with Mr. Naidoo. He's obviously free to explain why they brought the case, but I don't know how he is able to explain why we settled the case. I've already explained why we settled the case, that it was because win or lose, the so-called win 3 years down the line for us would have been meaningless, because the court would have remained with vacancies for that period. And if that is not a sufficient reason for him, or he thinks that all these commissioners really did that for the purposes of spinning, well, he's welcome to that belief. But ours, obviously, as a public interest body, was to look at the bigger picture. And there are many cases that are settled on that score. We know how long litigation can take in South Africa. If the matter went right up to the Constitutional Court, it could take up to 4 or 5 years or so. But the point about the delay is also slightly unfair. Everybody knows in South Africa that the JSC interviews in April and October of each year. It's a difficult and long process. To give you an example, in April, for the first time, we sat for 2 weeks, and this time we are going to be sitting for a week, but we're going to be doing a long number of interviews for different courts. The only reason we didn't sit in 2020 was because of COVID-19, and the JSC did not create COVID-19. And the reason why we had to make that up by a relatively longer session in April was to make sure that there's no backlog, and that's why it was done virtually, and we had to make all sorts of plans to make sure that the delay is not lengthened longer than what is necessary. Everyone knows that COVID broke out just a month before the April stint, and in October last year there was even a bigger outbreak.
If I may ask you, and I've asked you this question before and you've answered it, in terms of the criteria again, the question around the criteria, you say the criteria is quite clear. Lawson Naidoo says all it says is that candidates must be fit and proper. Surely this is an opportunity for the JSC to talk to important issues like integrity, like independence, like commitment to the principles of the Constitution. When we talk about clear criteria, should those principles not form part of it?
No, they do. I mean, it's not true that the criteria in the Constitution only say that it's fit and proper. The criteria in the Constitution talk about considerations of race and gender and so on. And some of us, myself in particular, have said that those criteria, even those in the Constitution, should be expanded. But I've even proposed a constitutional amendment in public to that effect. So when I say the criteria are clear, I'm not saying that they are perfect. I'm the first one to say that they should be developed. And we are a very young democracy. There's nothing wrong in anybody, because this is really for the public, suggesting particular criteria. I agree with you. I think that it should go beyond race and gender. I think that we should look at all sorts of things, religious, stance of a person in respect of gay rights. There's so many. The list is endless. But all those boil down to fitness and suitability and the issues that you mentioned, independence and so on, which is what we probe day in, day out from candidates.
I suppose the makeup of the panel is also part of what influences the kinds of questions we saw in the previous session, which were quite politically heavy.
Yes, well, again, that cannot be put at the door of the JSC. The people of South Africa, is their constitution. The founders of the constitution saw it in their wisdom that there should be a large number of persons who represent the people, so to speak, who represent parliament. And that is why you have a wide array of political parties that are interested proportionally in the JSC. And then the other grouping is the non-political commissioners, are those who come from, who represent the interests of civil society, academics, advocates, and so on. And then, of course, you have the judiciary also represented. Is that adequate? Maybe not. I mean, I've said in public that why are working class representatives, trade unions, and people like that not represented there? So, again, I think we must look at this positively and say, we're a young democracy. We are now approaching 30 years. Maybe some of these things should be relooked. That's how it should be. It's not a matter of, it's not a creation of the JSC. The JSC was constituted by the Constitution, not by itself.
So a big day for the country's courts. Lawson, Naidoo from CASAC, the Chief Justice's term also comes to an end in just a few days' time, October 11th. In another unprecedented move, the President calling for nominations from the public.
Well, indeed, Michelle, and that's an initiative that is to be welcomed. But just one clarification on Mr. Mpofu's answer just now. I know of no civil society representation on the Judicial Service Commission. As regards the process for appointing the Chief Justice, the President's initiative to institute an independent panel to assist and advise him in producing a shortlist that he will then need to consult with both the Judicial Service Commission and the leaders of political parties in the National Assembly is one that is to be welcomed. It means it's a more open, transparent, competitive, and we certainly hope a more robust process than we've seen in the past, where we have candidates competing against each other for the position, and that we as South Africans can be assured that the best person, man or woman, for the job is chosen to lead the judiciary in South Africa. This is a critically important position as head of the Constitutional Court, as the head of the JSC, but also very importantly as the head of the Office of the Chief Justice. So the independent panel has a tremendous task ahead of them, and we trust that South Africans will rally behind this very inclusive process that has been instituted.
Big day, big week for the judicial system here in South Africa. The JSC from this week rerunning those interviews for vacancies in superior courts this week, also marking the start of the process to find a replacement for the Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng. His term comes to an end on the 11th of October. Let me thank both of our guests for your time this morning. Lawson Naidoo is with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Advocate Dali Mpofu, JSC spokesperson. Thanks very much indeed.